The evening air outside the concert hall was crisp and calm, but inside the walls it buzzed with quiet energy. People hurried through polished corridors, adjusting lights, tuning instruments, and arranging seats. Among them moved a young woman with soft eyes and quick hands, carefully checking the piano on stage. Her job was simple: to make sure everything was ready before the audience arrived. She wasn't one of the performers. She wasn't part of the grand program that would fill the night with classical music. She was just a backstage helper, someone most guests never even noticed. But she didn't mind. Music had always been her world, even when life didn't give her many chances to be part of it. She grew up in a small town where her father repaired instruments for a living. Their home was always full of sound: violins, old flutes, and mostly the piano that sat near their window. That piano was where she spent hours after school, teaching herself to play by ear. Her father used to sit beside her, humming softly, sometimes falling asleep in his chair as she played. Those were simple times, but beautiful. Now, years later, working in this grand hall made her feel close to that old dream again, even if she was just a worker. Every night she stood in the shadows watching great musicians perform for crowds of elegant people. Sometimes she closed her eyes and imagined herself in that bright light, her hands dancing across the keys while the world listened. But she never said that dream aloud, not even to her co-workers. That night, a famous pianist was scheduled to perform, a man known around the world. People said his music could make anyone cry. The tickets had sold out weeks earlier, and the crowd expected perfection. The staff was told to make sure everything ran smoothly. No mistakes, no noise, no delays. The young woman checked the piano one last time, pressing the keys softly. The sound was clear and full. She smiled, running her fingers along the edge of the instrument like it was something alive. Music always made her feel calm, even when the world didn't. The main organizer walked by, clipboard in hand, giving out orders. He barely noticed her except to remind her to stay out of sight when the guests arrived. She nodded and stepped back into the corner, hidden behind the curtain. Soon the seats began to fill with people in fine clothes and shining jewelry. The air changed. It became heavier, full of perfume, whispers, and quiet laughter. The guests were the city's elite, people who liked being seen at the most exclusive events. Backstage, the mood was tense. The star pianist had just arrived, surrounded by assistants. He looked pale and tired, but he smiled politely as people greeted him. He had been performing for decades, and though age had slowed him down, his talent was still unmatched. The young woman watched him from afar, admiring how calm he seemed despite the crowd waiting for him. Minutes before the show began, something went wrong. The pianist was sitting in his dressing room when he suddenly leaned forward, gripping his chest. His assistant called for help, and chaos spread quietly behind the curtain. The doctor in the audience was called backstage, and soon everyone knew. The pianist wasn't well enough to perform. The organizer's face turned red as he paced the room. "We can't cancel," he whispered harshly. "Do you know who's sitting out there? We'll lose everything if we delay this." The doctor shook his head. "He needs rest. No performance tonight." The organizer looked around in panic. "Does anyone at all know how to play the piano?" The question hung in the air. No one spoke. The musicians were trained for other instruments. The stagehands looked down, pretending they hadn't heard. Then from the corner a small voice said, "I can." Everyone turned to look at her, the quiet girl who usually moved chairs and cleaned up after rehearsals. She felt her heart jump as the organizer stared. "You?" he said with disbelief. "You can play?" She nodded nervously. "Yes, a little. I've played since I was a child," he sighed, rubbing his temples. "This isn't some local cafe, girl." "There are hundreds of people out there, important people." "I know," she said softly. "But you need someone right now. I can play until he feels better, just to fill the silence." The assistant whispered, "It's better than keeping them waiting." The organizer groaned. "Fine, you have 10 minutes. If it's bad, I'll stop it myself." Her hands trembled as she walked toward the stage. She could barely breathe. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to turn back, to hide. But another voice inside whispered, "Maybe this is your moment." From behind the curtain, she peeked at the crowd. The lights were bright and every seat was filled. The murmur of conversation echoed softly. Her legs felt weak, but she took a deep breath and stepped forward. When the host announced that there had been a minor delay and that a staff member would play briefly, Confusion spread among the audience. Some people frowned, others laughed quietly, assuming it was a joke. She reached the piano, the same one she had polished countless times, but now it looked different, larger, almost intimidating. The stage lights blinded her for a second. She sat down slowly, trying not to look at the faces watching her. Her fingers hovered over the keys. The air felt heavy. For a moment she couldn't move. Her heartbeat was so loud she thought the audience might hear it. She looked down, closed her eyes, and thought of her father, his gentle smile, his words when she was a child. Play like no one is watching and let the music tell the story. And then she began. The first notes were soft, like a whisper in a quiet room. The melody she played wasn't famous. It wasn't written by anyone known. It was hers, something she had composed in the lonely nights after her father passed away. The song had lived only in her heart until that moment. The hall, which moments ago was full of restless movement, slowly fell silent. The sound of her playing spread gently, wrapping around the room like warm light. Her hands moved gracefully, gaining confidence with each note. She forgot about the audience, the organizer, the fear. She was back in her old living room, her father nodding beside her. Backstage, the staff stood frozen, listening. The organizer, who had been ready to pull her off the stage at any sign of trouble, lowered his hand slowly. Something about her playing felt different, real. It wasn't the perfect precision of a trained professional. It was something deeper, something that made people feel. The audience sat still. Even those who had been talking earlier now stared at the stage, faces softening. Some closed their eyes. The melody rose and fell like waves, carrying emotions that words could never describe. She played as if time had stopped. Each key she pressed told a story of dreams lost and found, of quiet love, of a heart that never stopped believing in beauty even when no one noticed. When the final note faded into silence, she kept her eyes closed, her fingers resting gently on the keys. She didn't know how long she sat like that. Then she heard it, a sound she never expected, applause. It started softly, then grew louder. The sound rolled through the hall like thunder. People stood up, clapping, cheering. Some had tears in their eyes. The host, who had been speechless, finally found his voice and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, let's give her a hand." She looked up, shocked. The bright lights blurred the faces, but she could see smiles, real ones. For a moment, she just sat there, unsure what to do. Then she stood and bowed slightly. Her cheeks were wet, though she hadn't realized she was crying. Backstage, the organizer stared at her, speechless. The assistant whispered, "I think you just saved the concert." She smiled faintly, her heart still racing. "I just played what I felt." As the applause continued, she stepped off the stage, her knees weak but her spirit light. She didn't care if people forgot her name tomorrow. For one night, her music had found its way into the world. And though no one knew it yet, what had happened in that concert hall would soon become a story that no one could stop talking about. The sound of applause still echoed in her ears long after she left the stage. She stood backstage, holding the edge of the curtain, her hands trembling but her heart glowing with something she hadn't felt in years, belonging. People were still clapping as the host tried to calm the audience down. Some even shouted for her to play again. It was a strange, overwhelming moment. She didn't know what to do, so she simply smiled shyly and bowed again, before stepping back into the shadows. The organizer rushed toward her, eyes wide. For a second she thought he was angry, but then his expression softened and he said in a low voice, "Where did you learn to play like that?" She hesitated, brushing her hair away from her face. "At home. My father taught me when I was a child. I never went to music school." He blinked, still staring at her as if trying to believe what he had just seen. That wasn't just good, that was special. Before she could say anything more, the sick pianist was brought in slowly by two assistants. His face looked pale, but his eyes were shining. When he saw her, he smiled gently and said, "I heard you play from the room. You have a gift." Those words made her throat tighten. She didn't know how to respond, so she just nodded. For her, that moment meant more than all the applause in the world. The audience outside had started to settle again. The host was explaining that the pianist would not be able to continue due to his health. Some people left early, but many stayed, hoping the young woman would play another piece. The night, which had started with panic, ended in a strange kind of magic. When the last guest finally left and the hall grew quiet, she sat alone on one of the stage steps. The piano stood in the center, its black surface glowing softly under the dim lights. She looked at it and smiled, half in disbelief. It was hard to process what had just happened. A few hours ago, she was just the backstage helper, the one who cleaned the piano, not the one who played it. And now people were calling her performance unforgettable. Her coworkers came by, patting her shoulder and whispering things like, "You saved us tonight," and "That was beautiful." One of the lighting technicians grinned and said, "You're going to be famous after this." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "No one's going to remember me tomorrow. They'll remember the music, and that's enough." But deep down, something inside her had changed. She had crossed a line she never thought she would. She had faced the fear that had kept her silent for so long, and somehow, without even planning it, she had touched hearts. When she finally went home that night, she walked through the quiet streets, her small bag slung over her shoulder. The city lights shimmered in puddles left by the evening rain. Every few steps, she smiled again, replaying moments in her mind. The feeling of the keys beneath her fingers, the sound of the applause, the pianist's kind eyes. At home, her tiny apartment felt different, almost warmer. On the table sat a small framed photo of her father, his face calm and gentle. She sat in front of it and whispered, "I did it, Papa. I really did it." For the first time in years, she felt at peace. The next morning, everything seemed normal at first. She got ready for work, tied her hair back, and caught the early bus to the concert hall. But when she reached the front doors, something was different. A small crowd had gathered near the entrance. She slowed down, confused. People were talking excitedly, holding up their phones. Then she saw it. A video playing on one of the screens in the lobby. It was her sitting at the piano performing the night before. Someone from the audience must have recorded it. The caption read, "The unknown girl who saved the concert." Her heart started racing. She stood frozen as more people gathered around the screen. Some of her coworkers looked at her with wide smiles. "You're trending online," one of them said. "Everyone's talking about you." She didn't know whether to be happy or scared. She never wanted attention. She just wanted to help when things went wrong. But now her face was on screens, her music being shared everywhere. Later that morning, the organizer called her into his office. He was sitting behind his desk, smiling in a way that surprised her. "You've become quite the sensation overnight," he said, pointing to his laptop. "People are asking who you are. The media is calling, some even want interviews." She shook her head quickly. "I don't know what to say in an interview. I'm not a performer. I work here." He leaned forward. "Maybe you're not a performer by title, but you are by heart. The truth is, what happened last night, it was more than luck. You have real talent. And the world is noticing." She didn't reply right away. All she could think about was how unexpected this all was. Just 2 days ago, she was invisible in the same hall. Now everyone seemed to know her name. In the following days, more surprises came. Local newspapers printed stories about the mystery pianist. Some wrote about her bravery, others about the beauty of her playing. Even the sick pianist, who had since recovered, spoke to a journalist, praising her for stepping in. "It takes courage," he said, "and it takes soul." She has both. The concert hall started getting phone calls from people wanting to hear her play again. At first, she laughed it off, thinking it was a joke. But the organizer was serious. He told her there was another event coming up, a smaller one but still important, and asked if she would perform officially this time. Her heart leaped and sank at the same time. The thought of being on stage again thrilled her, but also scared her deeply. What if the first time was just luck? What if she failed now that people expected more? That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind full of thoughts. She remembered how free she felt during her first performance, the peace, the emotion. Back then there was no pressure, only music. Now there were expectations, cameras, people waiting to judge her. But somewhere inside, another voice whispered softly, "Don't be afraid. This is what you were born to do." The next day she gave her answer. "I'll do it," she told the organizer quietly. "But only if I can play my own music again." He agreed. And so, preparations began for her first official concert. The hall wasn't as big this time, but still grand. The posters were modest, showing her name in small letters under the title, "An Evening of Piano." It felt unreal to see her name printed like that. In the week that followed, She spent every evening at the piano, practicing until her fingers ached. But she wasn't chasing perfection. She wanted to play with the same heart she had that first night. She practiced with her eyes closed, remembering her father's words. The day of the performance came faster than she expected. The hall was nearly full, the lights warm and golden. People whispered and smiled as they waited for her to appear. Some had come because they saw her video online. Others were just curious about the girl who had surprised everyone. Backstage, she took slow breaths, trying to calm herself. Her hands were cold, but when she touched the piano, she felt a sense of home. The same stage that once scared her now felt like the safest place in the world. When she walked out, the audience welcomed her with gentle applause. It wasn't loud or dramatic, it was sincere. She sat down, her heart racing, and began to play. The melody that flowed this time was new but full of emotion. Hope, loss, love, and quiet strength. Each note felt alive. She didn't need words to speak. The piano did it for her. As she played, she realized something beautiful. The audience wasn't just listening to her, they were feeling with her. The same magic that happened that first night was happening again. And it wasn't luck. It was real. When the last note faded, the hall was silent for a moment before another wave of applause began. She smiled through tears, bowing deeply. In that moment, she understood something powerful. Dreams don't always arrive the way we imagine. Sometimes they wait quietly until we find the courage to step into the light. That night, when she walked home under the soft glow of the streetlights, she didn't feel like the same person anymore. She wasn't just the girl who worked backstage. She was a musician, a storyteller, someone who had finally found her place in the world. And yet she didn't know that the story was far from over. What happened next would take everything even further, something no one in the city could have predicted. The days after her first official concert passed like a dream. Everywhere she went, people seemed to recognize her face. Some smiled kindly. Others whispered as she passed. The video of her first unexpected performance had already reached millions of views online. And now clips from her second concert were being shared as well. For the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. Reporters waited outside the concert hall. Strangers wrote her letters telling her how her music had touched their hearts. Some said her melodies made them remember their loved ones, others said they cried while listening. At first, she didn't know how to handle all this attention. She had always lived quietly, far away from noise and cameras. Her small apartment had always been her safe space, filled with books, old music sheets, and the photo of her father that sat near her piano. Now, everything was changing. The concert hall's manager called her into his office one morning. His face carried a proud smile. "You're bringing us more attention than any famous musician we've ever hosted," he said. "We've received offers from other cities. People want you to perform there. This could be your big break." Her heart skipped a beat. The thought of traveling and performing in other places was exciting, but also terrifying. "I never thought of becoming famous," she said softly. "I just wanted to play." "That's exactly why people love you," he replied. "Because you're real." She smiled, though she wasn't sure what real meant anymore. That evening, as she walked home, the city lights reflected off the wet pavement, and she caught herself humming a new tune. Music had always come to her naturally, like a whisper in her heart that turned into sound. She wrote down the melody as soon as she reached home, afraid it might disappear overnight. Over the next few weeks, invitations kept coming. Some from music festivals, others from small charity events. At first, she hesitated to say yes, but the thought of playing for more people who truly listened made her agree. Each time she performed, the response was the same. Silence during her playing, then applause that seemed to go on forever. But along with admiration came pressure. With each new performance, expectations grew. People started calling her the miracle pianist. Some claimed she was the future of classical music. Her story, how she had stepped in at the last minute and moved the audience to tears, had become something people romanticized. It made her feel proud, but also trapped. One night, after a performance in another city, she sat alone in her hotel room, staring at the lights outside the window. Her hands ached from hours of practice. She opened her phone and scrolled through the online comments. Most were kind, but a few were harsh. "Her music is too simple. She's not trained properly. She's lucky, not talented." She tried not to care, but those words cut deeper than she expected. She turned off the phone and sat quietly, her chest heavy. It was strange. She had been unknown all her life, yet it had never hurt like this. Being seen was harder than being invisible. The next morning, she visited the hall early to practice alone. The stage was empty, the lights dim. She placed her fingers on the keys and started to play slowly, each note echoing softly. But something was missing. The sound felt forced, empty. Her heart wasn't in it. She stopped and stared at her reflection in the black surface of the piano. "What's happening to me?" she whispered. She thought of her father again. When he taught her to play, he never talked about perfection. He talked about feeling, about telling stories through sound. He used to say, "Music isn't about being flawless. It's about being honest." That memory made her eyes water. Maybe she was losing that honesty now, buried under all the attention. That evening, she met with the sick pianist who had once been scheduled to perform on that first night. He had fully recovered and wanted to thank her again. They sat in the empty hall after hours, the soft glow of stage lights reflecting on the piano between them. "I watched your last few performances," he said kindly. "You're growing fast, but I can tell something's troubling you." She looked down, fidgeting with her hands. "I feel like I'm changing." "I don't know if that's good or bad." He nodded slowly. "Fame has a strange way of doing that. When you first played, you weren't thinking of the audience, you were thinking of the music. That's what made it special. Don't lose that part of yourself. It's rare." His words stayed with her long after he left. A few days later, she got a call from the concert hall manager again. "There's an international festival coming up," he said excitedly. "Musicians from all over the world are performing. They want you there." Her hands trembled slightly as she held the phone. It was the biggest opportunity yet. But part of her felt unready. She wasn't trained like the others. She didn't have fancy awards or certificates. She only had her feelings and her stories. Still, she said yes. The days leading up to the festival were intense. She practiced for hours, sometimes forgetting to eat. Everyone around her expected brilliance. "You'll be amazing," people kept saying. But inside, she wasn't sure anymore. The music she once played so freely now felt heavy. The night of the festival arrived. The hall was larger than any she had ever seen, with thousands of seats and tall golden balconies. The audience included critics, celebrities, and journalists from all over the world. Her stomach churned as she peeked from behind the curtain. When it was her turn, she walked onto the stage, her dress simple but elegant. She sat at the piano, the same nervousness returning that she had felt the very first time she played in public. The lights dimmed and silence fell. She began. At first, everything went well. Her fingers moved gracefully and the melody filled the air, but halfway through her mind went blank. She missed a note, then another. The sound faltered. A soft murmur spread through the audience. Her chest tightened. She stopped playing, her fingers frozen. The hall was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. For a second, she wanted to run off the stage. But then she remembered her father's voice again, warm and steady. "Play like no one is watching." She took a slow breath, closed her eyes, and began again. Not from the same part, but from the heart. The melody changed. It was softer, gentler, full of emotion. Each note carried her fear, her exhaustion, her love for the music itself. The crowd grew still. The moment she stopped trying to impress, everything felt natural again. Her hands moved freely, her soul guiding them. When she finished, there was silence for a long time, then applause that sounded almost endless. People stood clapping with real emotion. Even the other musicians joined in. Tears filled her eyes as she bowed, this time not out of fear, but gratitude. Backstage, reporters rushed toward her, but she didn't care about the questions. She walked straight to a quiet corner, sat down, and smiled to herself. She had learned something important that night. Perfection was never her goal. Honesty was. The next morning, news headlines praised her performance, calling it the most emotional moment of the festival. Some wrote about her mistake, but most wrote about how she turned it into beauty. The old pianist sent her a message that simply said, "You found your truth again." Her life changed once more after that. She received more offers than she could accept, but she chose carefully. She didn't want to play for fame anymore. She wanted to play for people, for hearts that needed to feel something real. She began visiting hospitals, schools, and small community centers, performing for those who couldn't afford concert tickets. Children would sit around her, wide-eyed, listening to her soft melodies. Elderly patients would close their eyes, smiling as she played. She found peace there, more than in any grand stage. Every time she finished playing, she would look up at the sky and whisper, "Thank you." Months later, she returned to the same concert hall where everything began. It was quiet that evening, the lights dimmed, the stage empty. She sat at the piano once more, her reflection in the polished surface smiling back at her. She placed her hands on the keys and played the same melody she had played that very first night, the one from her heart, the one for her father. As the sound filled the empty hall, she realized that the real miracle wasn't what happened in front of the crowd. It was what had happened inside her, the courage to keep playing, even when she doubted herself. And though she would go on to touch many lives with her music, that quiet moment alone in the hall would always remain the one she remembered most, because that was where everything had truly begun. Weeks passed since her return to the concert hall, and life slowly settled into a rhythm again. But it wasn't the same rhythm as before. The world had changed around her, and so had she. The hall that once felt like a workplace now felt like a part of her story, each wall holding an echo of her music, each step reminding her of that night when everything began. She had started to teach a few students in her free time, mostly children from nearby schools who couldn't afford formal lessons. She didn't charge much, sometimes nothing at all. What mattered to her was sharing the feeling she once thought she'd lost, the quiet magic of discovering music for the first time. Every morning she arrived early, long before others came in, to sit by the piano. She would play softly, just for herself. Those early hours were her favorite. No applause, no cameras, no audience, just her and the sound of the keys. It was peace in its purest form. One morning, while she was lost in her own melody, the old pianist who had once inspired her appeared at the door. He leaned quietly against the frame, listening. When she noticed him, she stopped, smiling warmly. "You still play like no one's watching," he said. She laughed softly. "That's the only way I know how." He walked in slowly, sitting beside her on the bench. His hands trembled slightly from age, but his eyes still carried the same light. "I'm organizing something," he said. "A special concert, a night dedicated to the power of music and its ability to heal. I want you to be part of it." Her eyes widened. "Me with you?" He nodded. "You reminded me of why I fell in love with music in the first place. I can't think of anyone better to share the stage with." The thought filled her with both excitement and fear. Playing alongside a master like him felt like a dream, but also a huge responsibility. Still, she agreed. In the weeks that followed, they practiced together. The rehearsals were unlike anything she'd done before. There was laughter, patience, and a shared love for every note. Sometimes he'd stop her mid-song to tell a story from his past, about performing in small towns, about mistakes that turned into lessons, about the strange silence that follows real beauty. "You know," he told her one evening as they rested, "the audience never remembers perfection. They remember emotion. They remember honesty. You have that." His words stayed with her. The concert was scheduled for a warm spring evening. Posters appeared around the city, simple designs showing both their names side by side. People were curious. Many had followed her journey since that first unexpected night, and now they were eager to see her perform with the man she had once replaced. The day of the performance arrived, and the concert hall was filled to its last seat. The air was calm but charged with quiet excitement. Families, students, musicians, and even those who had never been to a classical concert before, all had come to listen. Backstage, she felt her heart beating fast. The old pianist looked at her and smiled. "Don't think too much," he said gently. "Let your heart lead." When they walked out together, the audience stood and applauded before a single note was played. It was a rare, pure moment of respect. They bowed, took their seats, and began. The first half of the concert belonged to him. His fingers, though slower with age, still carried the strength and wisdom of a lifetime. Each piece he played felt like a conversation, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce, but always honest. The crowd was completely silent, hanging on to every sound. Then came her turn. She played her own composition, one she had written after their first meeting. It was a melody about courage, change, and quiet beginnings. The notes were simple, flowing like a stream. Halfway through the piece, she glanced at him. He was smiling softly, his eyes closed, listening as though he were hearing something long forgotten. When she finished, the hall was so still that she could hear the faint creak of a chair. Then slowly applause began, gentle at first, then louder until the whole room stood again. But this time she didn't feel nervous or overwhelmed. She felt grateful. The concert ended with both of them playing together, a duet they had composed just days before. It was called For the Moments That Find Us. The melody carried both of their stories, their struggles, their dreams, their rediscovered faith in music. When the last note faded, something remarkable happened. The old pianist reached over, took her hand, and lifted it into the air. The crowd roared, clapping endlessly. He leaned close and whispered, "Tonight, the stage belongs to you." Tears filled her eyes. After the concert, reporters and photographers gathered backstage. But this time, she wasn't afraid of them. She answered their questions calmly, smiling when they asked about her journey. "Music saved me," she said simply, "and I just hope it saves someone else too." That performance changed everything once again. Offers came from abroad, but she didn't rush into them. She wanted to grow at her own pace, to stay connected to the reason she started playing in the first place. She began to organize small charity concerts herself, performances in hospitals, shelters, and community centers. She often played without an audience that could clap or cheer, but somehow those quiet rooms felt even more powerful. Watching someone's eyes soften, or seeing a child smile for the first time in weeks, that was her applause. In one of those hospitals, she met a boy who had been sick for months. He loved the piano but had never played it himself. When she played for him, he watched her fingers closely and whispered, "It looks like your hands are telling a story." She smiled and said, "They are. And you can tell your own story too whenever you're ready." He grinned, weak but determined. "Then I'll learn." That simple exchange stayed in her heart. It reminded her that music wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about connection, about reaching someone's heart when words couldn't. Months later, the old pianist grew ill again. She visited him often, bringing her sheet music and playing softly by his bedside. One afternoon, as she finished a song, he took her hand and said, "Promise me something." "What?" she asked quietly. "Keep playing, even when no one's listening. That's when the music matters most." She nodded, tears filling her eyes. "I promise," he smiled faintly. "Good. Because one day you'll teach others what you've learned, the music, the honesty, the courage, and they'll carry it on." A few days later, he passed away peacefully. The news spread quickly and the city mourned him deeply. The concert hall where they had performed together held a memorial for him, inviting musicians and students from all over to play in his honor. When it was her turn to play, she chose the duet they had composed together. As she pressed the keys, memories flooded her mind, his voice, his laughter, the lessons he had taught her. By the time she finished, tears streamed down her face. The crowd stood in silence, some wiping their eyes too. It was a farewell not just to a mentor, but to a friend who had believed in her when she hadn't believed in herself. That night she stayed in the empty hall long after everyone had left. The stage lights were dim, the seats empty. She sat at the same piano they had shared and played softly, letting her grief pour into the music. When she stopped, she whispered into the silence, "Thank you for everything." The echo of her words faded into the stillness, but somehow she felt he could hear them. From that day on, she continued to play, not just for herself, not just for audiences, but for every person who had ever felt small or unseen. Her music became a bridge between people and emotions, between silence and hope. And every time she performed, whether it was in a grand hall or a small room, she carried his words in her heart. Play even when no one's listening, because that was where the real magic began, the kind that could astonish anyone, anywhere, even in the quietest corners of life. Months passed after the old pianist's passing, but his words stayed alive in her mind. Life at the concert hall felt different now. Every time she entered, she could still picture him standing near the piano, smiling, waiting for her to start playing. The silence of the hall sometimes felt heavy, but it was also comforting, like being surrounded by memories that refused to fade away. She kept teaching children, some from faraway towns who had never touched an instrument before. Her small classroom was full of laughter and noise, something the quiet concert hall had missed for years. She often watched them make mistakes, laugh about them, and try again. It reminded her that music was never about perfection. It was about trying, feeling, and growing. One afternoon, while she was teaching, a man walked in holding a folder under his arm. He introduced himself as a producer from a nearby city who had attended the tribute concert for the old pianist. "Your performance that night," he said, "was something I can't forget. I want to talk to you about something important." She listened quietly as he explained. His company was working on a project to record the life stories of great musicians and their students, focusing on how music changed their lives. He wanted her to be part of it. At first, she hesitated. She wasn't used to the idea of being in the spotlight again, but then she remembered what her mentor had told her, to share what she learned, to let others feel the truth of her journey. So she agreed. A few weeks later, a small film crew arrived at the concert hall. They followed her around as she taught, practiced, and even sat alone at the piano. She didn't act or pretend. She simply lived her routine the way she always had. The director told her, "Just be yourself. People will see the story through your music." During one of the recordings, she played the duet she had once performed with her mentor. As she played, her eyes filled with tears. The cameraman lowered his camera quietly, as if understanding that what he was witnessing was too pure to interrupt. The short film, titled "The Echo of a Note," was released months later. It didn't have any big advertisements or glamorous promotions, yet it began to spread quickly. People shared it online, not because it was flashy, but because it felt real. Messages started pouring in from strangers, students, parents, elderly people who had once played music but stopped long ago. Many wrote that her story reminded them why they loved music in the first place. One message stood out. It was from a woman who said she had been deaf in one ear since childhood, but still felt something when she watched the film. She wrote, "I can't hear the full melody, but I can feel it in my heart." That message made her cry. It reminded her again that music wasn't only for the ears, it was for the soul. The film's growing popularity brought new opportunities. Invitations came from music festivals and cultural foundations. But she stayed humble. She chose the ones that felt right, places where she could connect with people, not just perform for applause. One day she received a letter from the National Music Academy. They wanted her to be part of a new program, a mentorship that would guide young musicians who couldn't afford expensive training. She was overjoyed. It was exactly what she wanted to do. When she arrived at the academy, she was amazed by how grand it was. Tall ceilings, shining floors, and halls that echoed every sound. But behind all that beauty, she saw students who looked anxious, afraid of failing. She recognized that look. She had once worn it too. In her first class, she told them, "Don't chase perfection. Chase honesty. The audience doesn't want a perfect player, they want a real one." Some of them looked surprised, as if no one had ever said that to them before. She began to play a simple piece and asked them to listen, not just to the notes, but to the spaces between them. "That's where your heart hides," she said softly. Weeks went by and her classes became famous for being different. She didn't just teach techniques, she told stories. She shared how fear nearly stopped her from performing years ago, and how one kind stranger had changed her life forever. The students began opening up too. One confessed that he had almost given up music after losing a competition. Another admitted that she felt invisible next to others who played faster or louder. Each time she listened carefully and reminded them that music wasn't a race. "You have your own rhythm," she said. "Don't rush to find it, let it find you." Slowly, her class became a place of warmth and honesty. Even teachers from other departments started attending her sessions, curious to see what made them so special. Then one evening, as she was packing up, she noticed an envelope on the piano. It had no name, just a short note inside. "I was one of the students who heard you years ago at that first concert. I was sitting in the back row. I was about to quit music that night, but your performance changed something in me. I just wanted to say thank you." She read it twice, her eyes wet with emotion. She had no idea who wrote it, but it reminded her of how deeply small moments could touch others without us ever knowing. That night, she walked to the concert hall, which stood quiet and empty under the moonlight. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of old wood and dust, but it still carried a sense of peace. She sat at the piano and ran her fingers across the keys, remembering every performance, every fear, every smile. Then she began to play, not for anyone, not for fame, but for the hall itself. As she played, memories seemed to come alive. The old pianist's laughter, the applause from the crowd, the students' bright faces. The music filled the air like a soft breeze. After a while, she stopped and whispered, "I did what you asked." I kept playing. It felt like a promise fulfilled. A few days later, the Academy announced that it wanted to host a special tribute concert in honor of her mentor's legacy, and they wanted her students to perform. She agreed immediately, feeling proud and emotional. The students worked harder than ever. They practiced after hours, supporting one another instead of competing. She guided them patiently, teaching not just music but teamwork, confidence, and kindness. Finally, the night of the tribute arrived. The concert hall was full again, shining under golden lights. She stood backstage watching her students walk out nervously. She could feel their fear but also their courage. One by one they played their pieces. Some made mistakes, some forgot small parts, but the emotion in their playing was real. The audience clapped with warmth, not for perfection, but for sincerity. When the last student finished, she walked out quietly and joined them for the final piece, a gentle, hopeful melody called "The Promise We Kept." It was a tribute not just to her mentor, but to every person who had carried a piece of his lesson forward. When the final note ended, the hall erupted with applause. She looked at her students, smiling through tears. They had done it. They had carried the music forward. After the show, as the crowd slowly left, one of her youngest students asked shyly, "Do you think he heard us tonight?" She looked at the ceiling, at the dim lights glowing softly above. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think he did." That night, as she walked home, the city lights reflected on the wet streets after a light rain. She carried her violin case close to her chest, her heart full. Life had not turned out as she once planned, but maybe that was the beauty of it. Music had taken her through loss, fear and joy, but most of all, it had led her to people who changed her forever. And even now, years after that first concert where everything began, she still believed that some of the most astonishing things happen not in grand moments, but in quiet ones, like a single note that lingers long after the song ends. Years went by, but the memory of that night, the tribute concert for her mentor, stayed bright in her heart. The students she once taught had grown, spreading across cities, some becoming teachers, some performers, and some quietly sharing music in their own small ways. Each of them carried a little piece of her words, her warmth, and her belief that music was not about fame, but about honesty. She still visited the concert hall often. It had become more than a place of music. It was a part of her life. Sometimes she would sit in the empty hall for hours, not playing, just listening. There was something about that silence that always felt alive, like the sound of memories breathing softly around her. The city outside had changed. New buildings, new faces, new rhythms, but inside those old walls, time still seemed to slow down. One evening, as she was locking up after a lesson, she found a young woman standing at the entrance, holding a small bag and looking nervous. "Are you the one who teaches here?" the girl asked quietly. "Yes," she said kindly. "Do you want to learn?" The girl nodded, her eyes shining but uncertain. "I can't pay much," she whispered, "but I can help around, clean, carry things." "Anything," she smiled. "You don't need to clean anything. Just come and play." The girl hesitated, then followed her to the piano. Her fingers were shaky, her timing uneven, but there was something real in the way she played, a kind of raw emotion that couldn't be taught. When she finished, she looked down and said, "I know I'm not good enough." She placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and said, "You're not supposed to be good yet. You're supposed to feel, and you already do." That moment reminded her of herself, nervous, unsure, full of dreams and doubt. Over the next few months, the girl became her most dedicated student. She came early, stayed late, and practiced until her fingers hurt. She didn't have fancy clothes or expensive instruments, but she had something rare: hunger. One day after class, she asked, "How do you play without fear?" "I get so scared that people will laugh." The teacher paused, remembering her own trembling hands years ago. "I don't play without fear," she said softly. "I play with it. Fear doesn't disappear, it just learns to listen." Those words seemed to settle deep in the girl's heart. As the seasons passed, their bond grew strong, like an unspoken friendship between two souls who understood the same language without needing words. The girl often helped with small concerts, setting up chairs or turning pages during performances. She never asked for anything in return. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived at the concert hall. It was an invitation from a major cultural festival abroad, one that brought together musicians from different countries to perform in a grand hall known for its history and charm. They wanted her to represent her country. For a moment, she just stared at the letter, unsure how to react. It was the kind of opportunity she had never imagined would come again. She felt excitement, but also a deep sense of responsibility. She told her students about it the next day. Their faces lit up with pride, cheering for her. But then she noticed the young girl standing quietly at the back, smiling faintly, but not saying much. After class, she asked, "What's wrong?" The girl shrugged. "It's just, I'll miss your classes while you're gone," she smiled warmly. "I'll be back soon, and when I return, I'll have stories to tell." The girl nodded, trying to smile again. The weeks leading up to the trip were busy. She practiced every day not to impress the world, but to carry with her the voice of everyone who had been part of her journey. Her mentor, her students, the people who had believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. When the day finally came, the students gathered to see her off at the train station. They handed her a small notebook filled with their notes, wishes, and small sketches. On the last page, the young girl had written, "Don't just play for the world. Play for us too." She held the book close to her heart. The journey to the festival was long, and when she arrived, she was amazed by the beauty of the place. The grand hall where she would perform was enormous, with marble floors and golden lights. Musicians from every corner of the world were rehearsing, each with their own style, language, and sound. She felt a small flicker of nervousness, but also peace. She had been through enough to know that fear was only a sign that something mattered. On the day of her performance, the audience was large, people from different countries, journalists, and well-known artists. As she walked onto the stage, she could almost hear her mentor's voice whispering, "Play even when no one's listening." She sat down at the piano, closed her eyes, and began. The piece she played wasn't a showy one. It was simple, full of pauses like breaths between memories. Each note carried a story. The old concert hall, the laughter of children, the first time she found her courage, the moment her mentor lifted her hand in front of a cheering crowd. Halfway through the piece, she thought of the young girl and the students waiting back home. It gave her strength. When the last note faded, there was silence, soft, deep, and complete. Then the applause began. It grew louder and louder, filling the hall until she had to stand and bow, smiling through tears. After the concert, people came to congratulate her, but she remained humble, thanking them softly. Someone asked her, "What inspires you most when you play?" She smiled. "People," she said simply. "Every story, every kindness, every heartbreak, they all become music." When she returned home weeks later, the students were waiting at the concert hall with flowers and banners. The young girl ran to her, eyes sparkling. "I saw the video of your performance," she said breathlessly. "You looked so calm." "It was beautiful," she laughed softly. "I was trembling inside. But that's part of it." The girl hugged her tightly. "One day I want to play like that." "You will," she said. "Just keep listening to your heart." Years continued to pass, and she kept teaching, performing, and sharing her story. The young girl grew into a confident musician, performing in small concerts and later winning a scholarship to study music abroad. When she came to say goodbye, she handed her teacher a folded note. Inside, it read, "You once told me that music finds you when you're ready. It found me because of you." The teacher smiled, her eyes glistening. "Make sure you help it find someone else too," she said softly. When the girl left, she stood by the window of the concert hall, watching the street outside. The world kept moving, cars passing, people rushing, but inside her heart, time slowed again. That night, she sat alone on the stage where it all began. The lights were dim, and the only sound was the soft hum of the city beyond the walls. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play. It was a new melody, something gentle, born from years of lessons, love, and loss. As she played, she thought of everyone who had crossed her path, the old pianist who believed in her, the students who looked up to her, the audiences who listened silently, and the young girl who reminded her of her younger self. The notes flowed like a story without words, a farewell and a beginning at the same time. When the final chord faded, she let her hands rest on the piano. For a moment she sat still, letting the quiet fill the room. Outside the night deepened and the stars appeared one by one. She smiled softly, whispering, "I kept playing." And in that silence, it almost felt like the old pianist was somewhere near, smiling too, his promise fulfilled through every note that lived on. Years later, when people spoke about her, they didn't just remember her concerts or awards. They remembered her kindness, her patience, and the way she made everyone believe that music belonged to them too. The concert hall still stood tall, its walls filled with echoes of countless performances. And sometimes, late at night when the city grew quiet, those who passed by swore they could hear faint music coming from inside, a simple tune, warm and timeless, like a whisper of life itself. Because what really happened in that concert hall was never just about music. It was about people, about courage, about love that kept flowing, note after note, through every soul it touched.